All right, let's jump right into this explainer and unpack the incredibly rich history and the modern tragedy of Syria. We're looking at a region that's been inhabited for literally tens of thousands of years. It's a true crossroads of empires, but, today the headlines we see are just totally dominated by conflict and fracture.
And that brings us to a pretty profound question. How exactly does the literal cradle of human civilization become the center of a modern geopolitical collapse? Well, we can only answer that by digging into the deep roots of foreign intervention, the immense cultural wealth, and the massive political shifts in this region. We can't just look at the last decade in a vacuum, right? The historical context is absolutely everything here.
To really wrap our heads around the scale of the current crisis, we've got to start with the staggering human cost. 11 million people have been displaced by the recent conflict. 11 million. That's an almost unfathomable number. It represents lives, homes, and entire communities completely uprooted. It forces us to ask how a society reaches such a devastating breaking point in the first place.
And honestly, this is the ultimate tragedy of Syria. The very foundation of human history is currently being torn apart. Syria wasn't just a place where things happened. It was essentially the primary artery of the ancient world. Think of it as a massive, 5,000-year-old land bridge connecting continents, sitting right there squarely between the Mediterranean Sea and the vast desert to the east.
Part 1. Crossroads of Ancient Empires, the Cradle of Civilization. Because of its unique geography, this territory was basically a magnet for ancient superpowers. For centuries, relentless waves of foreign ambition just crashed over this vital land bridge. First, you had the Egyptian Empire stretching its power northward. Then, between 1350 and 1200 BC, the Hittites came down from Anatolia, leaving behind these advanced urban structures. By the 7th century BC, the Assyrians had swept in. In fact, ancient Assyrian historians actually claimed that Syria's history dated back to the very creation of heaven and earth. That is how foundational this land was to them.
But hey, Syria wasn't just being conquered, it was generating its own staggering cultural wealth. Take the ancient city of Ebla, for example. Dating way back to the 29th century BC, Ebla was an absolute powerhouse. Archaeologists have uncovered massive archives of baked clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform script there. It's solid proof that Syria was an epicenter of administration, trade, and intellectual life long before classical antiquity even began.
Now, this is absolutely mind-blowing. The very science of letters and writing, the stuff that advanced literally all human knowledge, was nurtured right here. The Phoenicians, who operated heavily out of the Syrian coast, developed an alphabet that completely transformed human communication. They took simple curves and straight lines and turned them into a structured alphabet. And amazingly, historical records show this alphabet appearing in a fully developed form, almost as if it materialized perfectly out of nowhere, to become the tool that would eventually record all global sciences.
Moving on to Part 2, the Islamic Golden Age, Wealth and Territorial Expansion.
Fast forward to the 7th century, and wow, Syria transforms from a conquered province into the beating heart of a global empire. The Umayyad dynasty, ruling right out of Damascus, took some very precise steps to stabilize and unify a massive multilingual territory. Caliph ad-Malik was a master administrator. To unify his rapidly growing empire, he standardized the administrative language to Arabic. Then, in a total stroke of economic genius, he ditched the chaotic mix of massive Byzantine and Iranian currencies and rolled out a uniform 2.75-gram silver coin. Plus, he spearheaded incredible infrastructure projects that are literally still standing today.
And it worked beautifully. Thanks to those administrative masterstrokes, state revenues surged to a staggering 25 million in the currency of the day. This brought the caliphate to its absolute zenith. Under the Umayyads, the empire expanded from Spain and the West all the way over to Central Asia. For a time, Damascus was practically the capital of the world.
But as history shows us, power eventually shifted eastward, which proves just how quickly fortunes could flip in the Islamic Golden Age. The Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads in the mid-8th century and moved the whole capital to Baghdad. The aesthetics and bureaucracy changed dramatically, leaning much more heavily into Persian influences. So, while Syria remained super important, it was no longer the political center. It set a historical precedent for how fast power dynamics could reverse in this region. Which brings us to Part 3, Centuries of Foreign Rule, from the Ottomans to the French Mandate.
This is where we enter a much darker chapter. Foreign domination during this time basically set the stage for the modern sectarian friction we see today. After the Ottoman Empire fell, Arab forces naturally expected independence. But instead, the League of Nations handed Syria over to France as a mandate, and the French explicitly used a divide-and-rule policy. They immediately carved Greater Syria up, separating Lebanon and creating distinct enclaves within Syria for different groups to purposefully amplify religious divisions. It was completely designed to prevent any unified national resistance.
The French essentially treated the region like an ATM to pay off their World War I debts. This brutal economic exploitation forced Syrian resistance underground and sparked some fierce nationalistic uprisings. They heavily taxed the population, suppressed the Arabic language, and totally ignored local customs. Make no mistake, it was a harsh military occupation in everything but name.
Things got so intense that the Great National Uprising of 1925 cost the French military roughly 30,000 men to suppress. The Syrian people united in a massive revolt across those artificial borders. The French responded with devastating force, even bombing Damascus itself. That response left incredibly deep scars and firmly planted the seeds of radical Arab nationalism.
Part 4. Independence to Authoritarianism, the Rise of the Baathists. So the French finally leave in 1946. And what's left behind? A massive, deeply unstable political vacuum. The demographics of the country were an incredibly diverse mosaic. Honestly, no other Arab country has such a varied ethnic and religious background. But this beautiful, historical diversity was about to be weaponized in a ruthless pursuit of absolute political control.
Enter Hafez al-Assad. Following a bloodless coup, the Baathist regime secured its grip by transforming what was a diverse national military into a highly concentrated, sect-loyal force. Assad, an Alawite general, systematically purged rivals from the military and government. By filling the absolute highest ranks with fiercely loyal members of his own minority sect, he built an ironclad security apparatus designed for one thing: protecting the regime at all costs.
And to maintain that grip, dissent was just outright eliminated through horrific institutional repression. The sources describe these prisons, like the al-Rashidia regiment, in chilling detail. Overcrowded, pitch-black underground wards where political opponents faced unimaginable torture and starvation. This state-run legacy of fear effectively silenced the general population for decades. Finally, Part 5. The Breaking Point. Descent into proxy war and fragmentation.
Think of Syria as a pressure cooker that had been building steam for decades until it finally exploded in March 2011. What started as peaceful protests calling for political reform rapidly spiraled into one of the most insanely complex multi-front wars in modern history. The regime met peaceful protests with absolute military force. Citizens formed militias to defend themselves, and very quickly the opposition fragmented. Radical groups like ISIS exploited the chaos, and then foreign powers, the US, Russia, Turkey, Iran, all poured in. It turned Syria's sovereign soil into a literal geopolitical chessboard.
The economic toll, absolutely devastating. The national GDP plummeted by an estimated 53% by 2014 alone. And remember, that was just 3 years into the conflict. Infrastructure was decimated, businesses erased, and basic necessities vanished. A country that used to be self-sufficient in agriculture and had a rich trade history was plunged into profound, desperate poverty.
And it's not just the economy, it's the literal history of the country being erased. Ancient heritage sites like Ibla and Palmyra were dynamited. Cities were leveled. The humanitarian toll is almost too massive to process. Beyond the staggering loss of human life in the millions of refugees, the intentional destruction of historical monuments was a direct attack on Syrian identity itself. It was an attempt to wipe out the shared memory of a complex, millennia-old culture. So, I want to leave you with this final thought. Understanding Syria's incredible historical resilience is really the only way we can grasp the true weight of its current struggle. This is a land that invented alphabets, built global empires, and survived countless conquests. The Syrian people carry that profound history within them right now. As the world looks at the rubble of modern geopolitics, we have to ask, how will the cradle of civilization rebuild itself for the next 1,000 years? Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the history behind the headlines.